Hello, friends, and welcome to the June 8th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about policy issues here in our great state and have a conversation about how you can engage in that process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and it is summer vacation for many, so it's a perfect time for a series on public education policy. We hope to provide some summer homework, not to prepare the kids to go back to school, but rather to prepare you for conversations with your elected representatives and candidates for office leading into election season, and to help you prepare for conversations we expect you'll need to have leading into the next legislative session. Joining us today will be one of the state's leading experts on public school policy, David Thompson, a partner with the Thompson and Horton law firm and legislative counsel for the Texas Association of School Administrators, Houston Independent School District, and more. Our Executive Director Bee Moorhead will join us to talk public ed as we begin this series, and Josh will join us for his weekly watch list to discuss the upcoming Supreme Court decisions that we expect to be announced soon. And to kick us off, our weekly word will sound a little bit different this week. I had a chance to talk with board member and chair of the North Texas Board of Church and Society, Reverend Phil Dieke, at the North Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, where he was preparing to offer a resolution calling for all North Texas churches to participate in elections by encouraging voting and participating in election infrastructure. Spoiler, the resolution did pass the very next day. And before we start, I want to continue along those lines. It is now officially general election season. The primaries and runoffs are complete, and the stage is now set. And I think it's important that Texans of faith and individual voters take a moment this summer to think about which issues are most important to you. Where will you spend your energy? Where will you focus your conversations? Do not let politicians distract you. Think about what you care about. Organize. Meet with candidates, organize some more, and create a plan to vote. Texas Impact has a list of legislative priorities that represent consensus positions of our member denominations, judicatories, and groups, and you can see those online. The Texas Impact Board this summer will begin updating those during their board retreat in July, and we'll have a series of events this summer and fall to roll that out, so watch this space. But we're intentionally beginning a series on public education, and that's on purpose. Public education was a dividing line in primary elections, and based on rhetoric from state leaders, I bet it will be a fight in 2023. While talking public ed, I know this wouldn't necessarily fall in the public education policy basket, but Uvalde is still front of mind for me and my family. Last week's episode was hard, but during it, Josh noted that after these school shootings, attention typically wanes after just a few days. Y'all, I have not forgotten yet, and I'm still mad. And I hope you are too. Do not forget, and don't let legislators off the hook for inaction. Texans of faith have an opportunity to shape narratives if we define our priorities and spend time having conversations and organizing. I hope we'll spend some time this week thinking about our public education system and how we can help our public school kids survive and thrive. We hope this episode helps. And with that, here we go. Our weekly word conversation with Reverend Phil Dieke of White Rock United Methodist Church in Dallas. Joining us for a short conversation today is Texas Impact Board member Phil Dieke, live from the North Texas Annual Conference. Phil, how you feeling?
I'm feeling better now that I got some food in my tummy. It's been a very long day at Annual Conference. So.
But it's been good to be around people again.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Yes, this is way better than the Zoom edition of Annual Conference.
It is, and so we're chatting because you and the Church and Society team here in North Texas put together a resolution related to voting. So why'd y'all decide to do that?
Can I be honest and just say that I felt
I would love for you to be honest.
I feel like Church and Society needs more presence in the conference, and so I thought this is a good way for us to get some time. No, I mean that is part of it, but really we put together. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say there are so many issues though. So why voting?
Well, right, totally. And so really why voting is because through the work we're doing with Texas Impact, it just felt like this was the most important work, and kind of like what Josh said over and over again, if we don't have voting, then nothing else matters. We're not going to get anything else done. And so I felt like it was important for us as a North Texas conference to then say, this is important to us as congregations as well. And if we really believe in the democratic process, which here we are at annual conference where we're going to be voting on things like this, right? Like it seems like a pretty easy go there. And, like it just, the state has wasted so much time and energy to pass SB 1 restricting voting. And so we felt like it was important as people of faith to say, like, every person is of value and of sacred worth, and the way they can express that is through their ability to vote.
That'll preach. It's almost like you're a pastor or something. I mean, well done, Phil.
I don't usually preach. I just,
So, what's the essence of the resolution?
So the essence is a little bit of just reminding our North Texas comrades here that we have something to say about this. And the Book of Resolution actually says, and I'm going to read to you here, it's actually the Book of Discipline. It says, we hold governments responsible for the protection of the rights of the people to free and fair elections. So we actually have documentation in our Constitution, not our Constitution, but in our Book of Discipline that actually says this is something that we prioritize and we hold our government responsible for, and that we think is a really important thing. So we just remind people that we have social principles and we have things that we believe in as a church. And then it goes on to say, therefore, we resolve that we want every North Texas conference to be backing the idea of both educating the electorate, but also encouraging people. And we want congregations to have 100% voting for those who are eligible, which, we don't have any way to track that as of yet, but it's something we're working to, is how can we, as a conference, provide opportunities for people, for congregations to say, here's what we're doing to make sure that elections can happen free and fairly, and also that we want to make sure that everyone's registered in our congregation and actually getting out there and working the polls as well.
So you've kind of addressed what you hope will come out of this.
Yep.
Anything else from this annual conference you hope people will be thinking about? I know you've addressed several other issues, or will be addressing several other issues through legislation.
Well, I mean, as you said, there's just so many things. Where do we start? Where do we stop? Right? I mean, we could go all day here, Scott, probably talking about, like, I wish we had more legislation on gun rights, and I wish we had legislation on trans rights. And I know there's one piece of legislation coming up on that as well, which I hope will pass for our conference. But, there's, unfortunately, Texas isn't making it easy for people of faith who really care about the value of all people. And so we could try to write resolutions all day long. Really what it comes down to is we just need to be people of faith, doing our best to love our neighbor and protecting the sacred worth of those people.
That'll preach. Thanks for the time, Phil.
Absolutely.
This week's episode was brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas, Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, and the COVID Collaborative.
Joining us for today's conversation is one of Texas's leading public school experts, David Thompson, a partner with the Thompson and Horton Law Firm in Houston, where he, among other tasks, serves as a legislative counsel for the Texas Association of School Administrators, Houston Independent School District, and other school districts, and so much more. David, thank you so much for the time today.
Good morning. It's great to be with you.
As someone who represents school districts, and we did an episode on this last week, but I feel like anytime I'm talking with somebody at all involved with public schools these days, I have to start by asking the reaction to the recent shooting in Uvalde. Any thoughts or reflections, anything you're hearing from school districts over the course of the last week?
We've heard quite a bit from a number of districts all over the state in the week. And of course, the first reaction is horrifying, not again. And hopefully we can move to how can we prevent this? I never want to say that prayer and reflection isn't important, but I do think people are recognizing we need to move beyond that to policy and action. I think about it twofold. Professionally, obviously think about liability issues for districts, think about safety of students and teachers and what can be done structurally with our buildings to enhance the safety of students and adults. And I also think about it personally. Our two daughters are public school teachers. And Scott, I will always say, teachers react first to look to the safety of their children and their students.
Right.
And we as a society need to do that. If we're not leading by thinking about the safety of our children, we're starting in the wrong place.
Teachers have absolutely been heroes in situations like this, but I think you're right. We shouldn't be asking them to do that. And my hope and my prayer that hopefully will lead to some action is that we'll spend some time during the next legislative session trying to figure out some solutions. But speaking of the Texas legislature, in terms of public education, it seemed like 2019 really seemed to go very nicely for the public education community. There seemed to be a kumbaya moment with the legislature going out of their way to support public schools. That started to unravel a little bit in the 2021 session with actions there, and it's continued as we move into this next election cycle. But let's start with public school funding. Should we be worried that the gains made in 2019 will not hold, or do we need to be concerned about public school finance as we head into the 2023 Texas legislature?
I always like to try to start as an optimist on any issue. I believe the state does have a significant surplus at the moment in state revenues. Our economy is doing well. I hope that continues. And of course, the comptroller's projections for the next 2 years looking forward will be critical when we get to Austin in 2023. I believe that the progress and gains that were made in funding in 2019 can be preserved. I don't expect those to be unraveled, but I don't want us to simply sit on our hands and think we solved every issue in 2019. That is somewhat the problem with school finance, in my view, over the last many decades, is we have kind of a cathartic reaction. We deal with it. Then it languishes for several sessions, things get out of whack, and then we have to have another cathartic reaction. So I think we can preserve the progress we've made in the past, but I believe we still have some good work to do that can continue to make the system even better.
I assume that's something that listeners should be talking to their legislators and candidates for office about over the course of the next few months, right?
100%.
And what's your message on that? Is it preserve the gains from 2019? Is it just fully fund our public schools? Do you have any advice for them on that?
I think it's several different points that need to be made. Certainly preserve the progress that we've made in funding in the past. I always do want to recognize when the legislature does act very I'm going to say very constructively, as they did in 2019 on public education issues. I always want to recognize them for that and thank them for the work they've done. And I think we need to start with that. Thank those who are still serving for what they've done in the past. Texas is a big, complex state. We have many school districts with under 200 kids, and then we have some of the very largest school districts in the entire country. We have some of the fastest growing areas in the entire country. We have areas of the state that are losing population. We have some of the wealthiest communities in the country, and we have some of the poorer areas in the country. So I think that diversity inevitably creates complexity in our system. And there are always going to be little tweaks and things we can do to recognize areas where there's improvement or needed improvement.
Before we got on the air, before I hit record, you mentioned the three-legged stool, and so I want to go through those three different legs. First, we hear of this idea about adequacy in Texas public schools. Quite aspirational, right, to talk about adequacy. But how do you define that, and are we adequate?
I would define adequacy just in very practical terms is do the resources that we're providing match up with the expectations that we have set in law and that we have in our communities? I'll give you a very simple example. If you or I were going to drive by car from Austin to Houston or Dallas, you would want to make sure there's enough gas in your car or enough charge in your battery if you're driving an electric vehicle to make the full trip. It doesn't it doesn't help you if you get 3/4 of the way there and run out of gas or electrical charge. And so simply, I think of adequacy as simply matching our expectations with the resources provided, so that we have a reasonable opportunity in all of these diverse communities to achieve the objectives that we've set for schools and for children.
And so what might an example of that look like in the public school realm?
Well, think about it this way. We have kids who come to school that are very learning ready. They've grown up in homes where they are read to. They know their numbers. They know their colors. They know their letters. They may be even reading one-syllable words. And we have kids that come to school with just as much hope and expectation about the future who may literally have never been read to by an adult.
Right.
And so meeting the different needs of different kids is going to take different resources. 60% of our population in Texas of our school-age kids come from homes that qualify for free or reduced price lunch. And there's every study that's been done for literally 60 years shows high correlation between kind of educational preparation, not intelligence, but just the preparation to be successful in schooling, and that background that kids come out of. But I think that's something we always have to pay attention to, Scott, is that kids who come from different backgrounds are going to need different supports and different resources in school.
So I think that probably leads to the next leg on the school, which is probably even a bigger lift than adequacy, is equity. How should we think about equity in public education, and how does Texas stack up?
Well, again, think about all of these diverse communities. We have 1,020 some odd traditional public school districts in the state. We have a few very unique districts. We have some districts that are wholly on military bases. And then we've got a couple hundred charter school systems or campuses scattered around the state. And think of equity as making sure that, again, in a very diverse state, that we provide everybody, it doesn't matter if you live in Houston or rural Texas or Austin, everybody gets a reasonable access to the resources necessary to compete with the other districts, to attract teachers, to provide programs, and again, to meet those objectives that we've set for all schools and all kids. Equity is really just about kind of leveling the playing field, if you will. And of course, in a system like Texas, which is heavily dependent on local property taxes, the majority of our support for public schools does come out of local property taxes. The state is actually the minority partner in supporting our schools, but we need to make sure that state resources are used in a way to level the playing field so that all districts, all campuses, all kids are treated reasonably equally in our big, diverse state.
I want to come back to property taxes in a second, but I do want to give you a chance to weigh in on the third leg of that stool, which would be efficiency. So how do you think about that, and how are we doing there?
Well, our Constitution actually uses the word efficient. Since 1876, and this provision is unchanged, it shall be the duty of the legislature of the state to establish and make suitable provision for an efficient system of public free schools. We want to make sure that resources are used well. School districts, in my experience, provide more information. There's probably more transparency around how districts use funds. We can always be better, but we want to make sure that we use resources in a purposeful way that is non-wasteful. And so think of those three stool legs: adequacy, which means it's fit for the purpose for which we've set it; equity, leveling the playing field, and efficient, be purposeful and non-wasteful in our use of resources.
You did mention property taxes, and my guess is that most people listening have seen their property tax bill for next year, and my guess is for many of us that went up by kind of a lot. So those have been soaring over the course of the last few decades. As a result, has school funding increased dramatically as well because of those increases in values? And if not, why not?
Well, that's a great question, Scott. And, the way we fund schools is different than every other political subdivision. All of us who own property, annually, we see our values go up. I will tell you, I'd rather see my values going up than going down.
Right.
If I have to choose one or the other. And we see our property tax bill getting bigger. And I talk to my neighbors and friends, and people say, I don't get it. Why are schools struggling about funding? It seems like taxes are going up every year. What people don't understand in our system is as local property owners put more money into the system, the state is simultaneously, because it's simply the way our formulas work, the state reduces its contribution. So if you will, the size of the glass stays the same. The mix in the glass changes. As property taxes go up, state revenue used to continue to fill the glass simply reduces. And that's kind of an inexorable, function of the formulas. The state actually treats rising property values and rising property taxes from a state standpoint. That is actually an indirect source of state revenue that is worth billions of dollars every biennium to the state, because it reduces state expenditures to schools and frees up those state dollars to be spent elsewhere in the budget. The only way to actually increase funding for schools and make sure that property tax dollars that taxpayers think they're spending to support their schools actually go to their schools, is for the legislature periodically to increase the formulas.
So our listeners have been challenged, and I'm confident they're going to be up to the task, but they're going to be meeting with their elected representatives and candidates for office this summer, and as we head into November, then again as we head into the January legislative session. And I know that many Texans of faith support the values that we've talked about today, support public schools and their communities. What do you hope listeners will talk to the representatives and candidates about between now and November? What issues do you think really need some extra attention as we move towards the next legislative session?
I would ask everyone to when you have the opportunities, to talk to your members before the session begins. And those of us who've worked around the legislature know that the actual session itself is relatively short. We're one of only 5 states, and we're certainly the only large state that meets every other year. And we only meet for 140 days. So it is a very intense period. And our members work very hard. I mean, you can find members in their office at 7 a.m. You can find members in their office at midnight. And you need to make have conversations with them before the session begins. I would always start by thanking people for public service, whether they're on a school board,
Absolutely.
in the Texas legislature, wherever people serve. We need to recognize that and express our appreciation. And then I would ask people to simply reinforce to their members the importance of public schools as a social good to our communities. It is a place where kids of all backgrounds, all wealth levels, different faiths, different life experiences meet and frankly learn together. And it's important that our state continue to support our public schools. And again, that provision of the Texas Constitution that has been unchanged since 1876, that's literally the only place in the Constitution where the word duty is used. The legislature must do this because of the connection between strong public schools and, frankly, a healthy democratic society. And then think about the needs of our different populations. We have kids who are being very successful with at the most challenging academic institutions in the entire world. But we have a lot of kids who come from backgrounds where they simply don't start life. They don't start school with those resources or those experiences. And schooling is where they're going to learn to read and learn to experience life. And we always need to remember the least among us.
Well, it's not a Sunday. We're not in church, but I'll give you an amen for that one, David. Any shameless plugs or anything you'd like to leave us with today?
No, I will say on behalf of our firm, we represent schools, community colleges, four-year colleges all over Texas, and in fact, all over the country. We're honored to work with educators and people who support public education. Every day, I feel very fortunate as a lawyer to work in this role. And I thank you. I thank Weekly Witness and all of your supporters for the good work they do. And I know if we continue to work together, we will continue to make progress in Texas and with our legislature.
Well, David, I really appreciate the time today. And more importantly, appreciate the work you're doing every day on behalf of public school kids, public schools throughout the state. Thank you so much. And we'll look forward to seeing you in Austin soon.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
Rejoining us today is Texas Impact's Advocacy Director, Joshua Houston. Hey, Josh.
Hey, Scott.
I know we've had a lot of conversations over the last few days about what I've been doing over the course of the last week, which is attending a lot of United Methodist Annual Conference. It is judicatory season, and we'll probably have some news coming out of that that we'll be able to talk about in the next couple of weeks. But you've been watching something completely different, something that's probably more likely to make the news than annual conference resolutions, and you've been watching the Supreme Court. Is that right?
Yeah, every summer about this time, I get to watch the Supreme Court and see what they're going to do next. And so for this week, Scott, and really the next 3 weeks, I'll be watching the Supreme Court. June is the traditional end of the Supreme Court's term. And this term, they have granted what's called certiorari, or they have heard 59 cases that they're going to decide. And at this moment, they have about 29 cases to be decided. Usually Mondays and Thursdays are decision days, but that's a rather flexible custom. And if there's a holiday that is Tuesday, or they just add decision days like today, which is Wednesday. So it really just depends on whenever the work is complete. And usually,
so what are you watching? What should we be paying attention to?
Well, they hand down their most controversial decisions at the very end of the term before they take a summer break. And so this term, there's going to be the big macro story of whether Chief Justice Roberts can continue to keep the court minimalist. In other words, having very narrow decisions that don't do a lot of big things, minimally change the law. That seems very unlikely, however.
What big decisions are still sitting out there? I mean, obviously we've seen some in the news, but what are you watching?
Okay, so of course the big one that's going to take up all the oxygen is Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. And that's the abortion case that seems highly likely to overturn Roe versus Wade, and the subsequent cases like Planned Parenthood versus Casey. There's about 50 years of case law that is going to be potentially upended. And people think that not just because of the league draft, but more because of how the justices have voted in recent litigation over the past 4 years, and then the replacement of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg with the Justice Amy Coney Barrett. So it's highly likely, based on all that they will return the issue to what they call the political process, which means that states will have to decide what their laws are going to be. And that means that states will decide based on who voters elect at the ballot box. So if you've been neutral all these years because Roe versus Wade was on the books, then your time for neutrality is coming to an end. So for Texas, this would have implications for the issues still pending from previous litigation over the past, I guess it's been half a decade now at least, from the Whole Women's Health versus Hellerstedt and the pending Whole Women's Health versus Jackson opinions, which struck down parts of House Bill 2 and subsequent things that the Texas legislature has done over the years. And it will have a number of implications, some known and many unknown, that will play out. And if this all comes to pass, like most people, court observers think, it's going to be seismic. And I feel quite certain we'll be exploring this topic further in the future, so we'll move on to other cases.
So that is the big one that hasn't been in the news, but what else are you watching?
There are a number of immigration cases. There's one called Golan versus, I think it's pronounced Saada. It affects child asylum claims. You have a second case, Biden versus Texas, which is the litigation over the MPP, Migrant Protection Protocols, or more commonly, the Remain in Mexico policy. You have a third case called Garland versus Gonzalez, which is a case regarding detainees' entitlement to bond. And then just today, in a fourth case, you had Egbert versus, I think it's pronounced Boulay, where the Supreme Court limited civil rights lawsuits, further limited civil rights lawsuits against Border Patrol agents. And it is really allowing Border Patrol agents to have really a great amount of discretion and authority and a lack of accountability. So broad, and this was a case from previous terms, but it's worth bringing up again, you cannot even sue a Border Patrol agent if that Border Patrol agent shoots an unarmed child across the river, which is a thing that actually happened about 2 years ago in a case called Hernandez. You'll have a number of decisions on vaccine mandates. You'll have two of those, Biden versus Missouri, and then NFIB versus OSHA, and this affects federal employees and private businesses. You've got a likely decision pending on the environment, which is West Virginia versus EPA, a big case over the executive powers and the Clean Air Act. And then what would a Robert Supreme Court term be without further erosion of true religious liberty, which requires a separation of church and state? You have four cases doing damage to our well-settled case law that is no longer well-settled. You have Shurtleff versus City of Boston, already decided, where Boston denied a group the right to fly a Christian flag on city property. However, it was deemed that this was not government speech somehow, but private speech, and therefore must be allowed. You have a court case called Ramirez versus Collier, and this one may come out okay, but the reasoning will matter, is a suit against Texas because Texas disallows chaplains in the death chamber, and it is further litigation on that issue that's been ongoing for about half a decade. You have a court case called Carson versus, probably pronounced Macon, M-A-K-I-N, which is further eroding the disestablishment clause and allowing taxpayer dollars to be used to fund sectarian education. And then finally, you have Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, which is a pray-to-play case, which could overturn decades of precedent regarding school prayer and the coerciveness that occurs when a coach, a government employee, imposes his religion on the rest of the team who just want to play a sport. And then finally, you have the issue of guns in a court case called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. And that issue in this case is whether the Second Amendment guarantees all Americans the right to carry concealed firearms outside the home for purposes of self-defense. And it'll be really illuminating to watch just how broad or how narrow the Supreme Court goes here on this case. And you know, it's kind of an interesting, this is probably the second most controversial one, although that's up for debate. But if the Supreme Court decides to return the issue of abortion to the states, but then decides to take away from the states the issue of gun control, that is an interesting conflict of their views of federalism and states' rights as their guiding principle.
Right. You bring up all of these cases, and certainly people will be watching, people will be paying attention because the results will impact our everyday lives and the lives of people in our communities. But one of the other reasons that it's important to be paying attention to these is because, as you mentioned, several of these issues will be returned to the states. And so on some of these issues, the state legislature might be dealing with issues that they previously wouldn't have been dealing with. And so it's important for us to be paying attention because we're going to have conversations with our elected representatives about topics we haven't talked about before, right?
That's right. Yeah, I think, Scott, it's really important to say this explicitly. I was kind of glib about the conflicting views of federalism that they have. There is an underlying principle that's unspoken that we should probably be talking more about, and it's the contested concept of freedom. So when Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, he identified two twin pillars that made American democracy. That was the concept of liberty and equality, and it must be both. The principle being put forth when people say liberty these days, they often mean that they should have the freedom to impose their will on others. And that's not American. That's the social Darwinism of Herbert Spencer that we rejected long ago in the early 20th century. Nevertheless, here we are again. They seek the legal authority to be free to impose their will on those that they deem to be the other. And they do not view liberty as a thing that we all equally share. So we've said it many times, but it bears repeating again, the famous phrase of a Harvard law professor from 100 years ago: you have the right to swing your arms wildly, if you like, but that liberty ends where somebody else's nose begins.
All right, so we have a lot to be watching over the course of the next few weeks. I'll also say if Josh mispronounced any of those names, he would invite you to tweet at him at TX Impact Counsel, and he would love to hear your feedback there. Josh, anything you want to leave us with today?
No.
All right, thanks again. We'll be watching with you. We'll talk to you soon.
Good to be with you, Scott.
Joining us for today's response is Texas Impact's Executive Director Bee Moorhead. Hey, Bee, how you feeling?
Hey, I'm doing good. How are you, Scott?
I guess I'm good. Like in light of like everything that's happening in the world, my life is fine, I guess. So we'll talk about some of that later. And I just got to spend a few days at the North Texas Annual Conference. So it was good seeing many of our listeners there. Had several people talk about the podcast. That was exciting.
That's exciting. And our people were in excellent form, passing resolutions and having lunches and talking about hard topics. We were proud of them.
Yeah, it was a good couple days up there. So well done, people of the North Texas Annual Conference. The rest of you will have some opportunities to see you soon.
Yep.
We'll talk about that at the end of this conversation. But let's start with the conversation that we just had with David Thompson. And I know you had a chance to listen into that. What were your immediate reactions?
Well, my first immediate reaction was, gosh, we're so fortunate to have David Thompson and his colleagues who are the institutional memory of our entire public education system in this big, complex state, as he described it. I just felt really fortunate that we were able to hear from him and that he explained so articulately and clearly, as is his way, what all exactly is at stake in our public school system and public school funding. But particularly, of course, the part that I latched onto was his description of the three-legged stool of school funding. You and I have talked about this. We've known and loved the three-legged stool for a long time, but it gave me, listening to him, gave me some new perspectives and helped me in particular put in perspective one of those legs. So the first leg, of course, being equity. That's something that the faith community has long been a champion for. We have often focused all of our public school energy on how important it is that children all over the state get access to the same quality education, and that it not be that what zip code you live in determines the quality of the public school education that you receive. Something that's probably not an unfamiliar concept for your listeners, our listeners. Also something that people would kind of affirm conceptually. The second concept, the second leg of the stool, is adequacy. We have often stayed away from adequacy. We've often said, as the religious communities, we're not really in a position to judge what's an adequate public school education. We're leaving that to the experts. David Thompson gave it a slightly different spin that I think was so important. He said, adequacy has to do with whether you have the funds to do what you say you're going to do.
Right.
So it doesn't have to do with some objective measure of what's an adequate public education. It has to do with whether the funding that you have is adequate to meet the expectations you have set. In that regard, I would challenge voters to think about how many times they've heard legislators talk about the best public education system, world-class education, the top-notch, competitive, all those language, all those terms. Those are expectations we're setting for ourselves as the state of Texas. We could say we're not having those things. We're having
inadequate system.
We're gonna have everybody learn to read at a third grade level and do some sums and call it good. Our children, we don't expect to become astronauts or diplomats or to find cures for cancer. We don't have high aspirations. But that is not what Texas has said. That is never what Texas says. So when we hear the conversation about equity and adequacy, we should remember adequacy refers to things we said we're going to do, not an externally imposed set of metrics. I find that somehow to me this week, maybe in light of everything that's going on, maybe in light of Uvalde, that was a whack on the side of the head for me to remember in a democracy, we're the ones who say what we're going to do. And what's adequate is enough money to do the thing we promised ourselves we would do. As far as efficiency, I also found that term interesting when he talked about it. He focused a lot on the idea of waste. I would say in the faith community, we do a lot of things and we affirm a lot of things that are not necessarily without waste. We don't always put the highest priority on perfect technical economy and efficiency in all of our activities. And I wonder if we should talk about that and not to get right with it, but to remind ourselves why it is that sometimes lack of waste is not the only measure of efficiency. It is definitely important. It's definitely when people think of an efficient budget or an efficient process, they think of not wasting movements, not wasting money, all of those things. But I would suggest to you, Scott Atnip, when you think about a high school campus, is there any piece of real estate on that campus that you think is not used perfectly, efficiently for the most number of students to be served all the time? Might not that big field of AstroTurf with those benches up way away from the field, is that not possibly not a perfectly efficient use of space? One person's waste is another person's necessity.
See, I live in Texas, so I'm not going to answer that question for you. I did think that the three-legged stool piece was interesting and certainly relates to a lot of other work that Texas Impact is involved in. We do have a lot of priorities that we could talk about that same concept with, but I also want to spend a minute, since we have you, talking about priorities and what it is that Texans of faith care about, what Texans of faith have historically cared about, And our board's going to be meeting, Texas Impact's board is going to be meeting in July to look at legislative priorities for the next biennium. And for almost 50 years, 49 years now, right? Texas Impact has had legislative priorities, and we're going to do it again this time. And from the beginning, some have come and gone, but one constant in those priorities has been public education in Texas and making sure that we have a quality public education system in Texas. Why is that so important to Texans of faith?
Well, I think the reason public education is so important, and David Thompson said it as well, is that in our Constitution, there's a line drawn between public education and a functioning democracy. The idea is that we can't have the democratic system that we depend on if all of us aren't educated enough to be able to play the roles. And we know it's not just whether you can vote, whether you can read the ballot, whether you can understand the questions on it. Our whole system runs on volunteers, and that includes the election system. Also, honestly, Scott, you and I both know legislators are not well paid. They're not well compensated. They are truly public servants. And in other levels of government, school board members aren't paid. So we are depending on a voluntary system to maintain all of these other systems, our transportation, infrastructure, security, health and human services, all of those things that all of us need, want, depend on. So everybody has to be educated enough to play the roles that need to be played to make that system go. So that's a reason for public education to be important. Now, I mentioned one, healthcare. You can immediately jump from public education to healthcare and say, one, healthcare is the second biggest object of the budget, interestingly, after public education. Similarly, related to the core function of the individual in a democracy, people have to be able to be themselves, to play their role in the community, and to be healthy is a prerequisite of that. Also, we know health is related directly to education. When children and their parents are not healthy, they aren't able to participate in the school system. And in fact, that contributes to inefficiency in the school system in a different way. They don't go to school, or they can't keep up, partly sometimes because of health issues. One of the things that's been interesting to me this summer so far is, and I guess we've got plenty of long, hot days to go for there to be a lot of things to be interesting to me. But, you know, I did a blog post last week called Remember Medicaid. For years and years, Medicaid has been one of the top one or two issues Texas Impact has worked on over and over every year. We talked about Medicaid. And, you know, we've kind of come to terms, I think, that this legislature does not intend to expand Medicaid to people who really, really need health insurance. Why? It's political. It's not a good financial choice. It's not a good choice for our entire healthcare system. It's not a good choice for our local communities. It's not a good choice for our school system. It's just a political decision, but it seems to be a decision that the majority of legislators have taken. They've weighed the odds and found that they prefer the political gain of opposing Medicaid expansion to the policy gain of expanding it. But now into the picture comes the wind down of the public health emergency of COVID and all the other health insurance opportunities that became available from the federal government during COVID. So we have people who have been able to stay on Medicaid a long time because of COVID. We have people who got really good deals in the marketplace for health insurance because of COVID. And those things are starting to unwind now. And Texas, I think, is about to hit another cliff, another uninsured cliff, where suddenly we're going to have a bunch of people dumped off of insurance. So I do kind of feel like, remember a couple of years ago when we had a big problem with uninsured? We still do. We still do.
Right.
That's still a problem. It's about to hit the headlines again, just when you thought maybe that was one thing that you weren't quite as worried about. And I think the adequacy piece there is just as important. If we say we're going to provide hospital systems and preventive care and all of those things, then people expect them. People expect that in the United States, in Texas, if you are sick, you could go to a doctor and they would prescribe you medicine and it would make you well. And what we have is a situation where our system, our funding for healthcare, including failure to accept those Medicaid dollars, is making it that our funding is not adequate to meet the expectations we have set for ourselves.
You've talked about public education, or we've talked about public education. We've talked about Medicaid, and those are certainly two issues that the legislature will have to at least consider going into 2023. There are a lot of other things going on in the world right now.
There are.
We talked last week about Uvalde, and you've mentioned it.
Yeah.
You mentioned the fact that it's hot outside, and probably about to get myself in trouble both at home and with my my environmentalist friends. But every time I get an alert saying I have to turn the air conditioner up to 78 or whatever, I get yelled at home. So the grid is constantly an issue we're having to think about. Josh talked about Supreme Court decisions that are coming up. There's so much going on in the world right now. What do you have to say about the political climate in Texas? I know it's hot as the season warms up, but what do you note about that, and what do you hope people will be doing with it?
I think the political climate is nonlinear. I do. I think every time, and therefore it is distracting and disconcerting and disempowering for voters. Every time they think they know what the issues are that are going to be the most concerning to them, something else happens that just kind of resets the table. So people were, several months ago, they were really concerned about trans children and some decisions the governor had sent down about the way the state agencies were dealing with families of trans children. That has in some ways been displaced by concern about guns and children being the object of gun violence. The grid at this point is like a time bomb. Everybody's just waiting. I mean, I told you I'm watching Twitter, and you just kind of see as the mercury rises, the tweets get more frequent and more feisty about what's going to happen. Is it going to hold this time? In this day and age, we should not be having people asking, do you think the grid will hold up this week during the hot weather? That's not something, right. I mean, the default position should be yes, because it always does, but apparently that's not the case. So it's hard for people to function. People tell me they just turn off, they shut down, they can't decide which thing to focus on. So they decide not to focus on anything, or they focus so quickly, sequentially, that they don't have any impact. They quickly go through their, clicktivism. They like this post, sign this form, donate $5 to a thing and call it good. That's not the way. That's not the way. It's not the way for people to feel empowered. It's not the way to make policy changes that are lasting. It's not the way to make culture change that will make us all feel better in our own skins and in the grocery store with our friends and neighbors. Later this summer, we're going to be holding, as we do typically, a series of training events. We call them Faith and Democracy, FIND, in cities around the state, and they'll also be available online for people who are not in those cities or don't want to leave the house because it's too hot. But they will, I asked you if you thought this was a fair metaphor. You said yes. They're basically spring training for advocates before the legislative session. They are a way to gear up to hear some faith language that will remind you why the faith leaders in your community are engaged in public policy and advocacy and activism, and why you should be too. They are training on refresher, or for people who didn't know in the first place, how the legislature works, what the ways are to be an effective advocate in the process, and workshops on specific issues people care about. We hope that people will sign up for those FIND events, and we hope that whether they attend an event or not, they'll go to our website and sign up for ways to be engaged during the legislative session and before the legislative session in issue advocacy and building relationships with legislators and helping to mobilize their friends and neighbors and colleagues around the issues that the legislature takes up. We can't guess what the issues will be all the time, but we can guess that people of faith are going to be necessary to the story.
It will be so exciting to see people in person this summer and fall. So friends, make sure you're keeping an eye on texasimpact.org, all the social media channels for information about that. Be anything else to add before we close out?
No, I think I've taken enough of your time today, Scott.
All right. I'll also say when she said, don't just click on the $5 donate thing and assume you're done, we'll also take your $5 donation at texasimpact.org. So didn't want to step on that message.
Fair point.
Well, I really appreciate the time. Thanks for all you do, and we'll look forward to talking with you again soon.
Awesome. Thanks.
I want to thank our guests today, Reverend Phil Dieke, David Thompson, Josh Houston, and Bee Moorhead. But I especially want to thank you for tuning in. Summer is here. It's hot outside, and the Texas political sphere might be even hotter. But again, I hope Texans of Faith stay focused on our communities, our schools, our kids, and creating the communities and world we want to live in. Spend some time defining your policy priorities. Have conversations, organize, and create a plan to vote. We hope this podcast equips you to do that. If you have questions or suggestions for the podcast, please reach out to me at scott@texasimpact.org. And with that, it's time to draw this episode to a close. If you've stayed with us this long, you must have enjoyed the content. So I hope you'll share it with your friends and congregations and leave us a rating or review. That way, even more of your friends can find us and join in the movement for justice in Texas. And y'all, there's a lot going on, so keep an eye on Texas Impact's social media. We'll have announcements soon about Texas Impact's legislative agenda. We'll be talking about our FIND events. So make sure that you're subscribed and following all the things. And remember, if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members of Texas Impact by going to texasimpact.org. Y'all, there's a lot of noise, but your priorities are important. So let's get to work making sure that people are paying attention. The world needs Texans of Faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnet, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is Bee Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.